Greetings once again from yours truly, that Gnostic teacher on the internet. Here I am, facing a challenge and presenting a challenge to you. So I challenge you to listen to what I have to say all the way through. And I challenge myself to say something that's going to be worth your time and attention, and something that's going to matter, something that will make a difference, something that will give you courage, insight, sobriety, and moral support in facing the tremendous event in the world drama today. That is to say, the unparalleled, horrendous psyop of COVID-19. This talk is a follow-up to the previous one. I said in that talk it was something of a cliffhanger. I didn't name the two myths specified as having a unique status among the entire array of world mythology. So I'll specify that in this talk. And as well, I will tell you why it is important, why it matters to know about these two myths. So I'm calling this talk Two Myths at War for Human Identity. Or you could say two myths at war over human identity, whatever human identity might be. To paraphrase it again, in perhaps a more pertinent way, I could say two myths at war over your sense of humanity. Your sense of humanity is at stake in this war. And the two myths that I'm going to be revealing describe humanity in two utterly different ways. They do so due to their unique status, as I said, but it's worth repeating, of being generic origin myths and not race-specific origin myths. Now, that's specialist jargon from my field, my calling, my genre of comparative mythology. I really invite you to take on that specialist jargon and make it your own. I assure you that it will prove to be extremely valuable in clearing your mind and giving you a better orientation to what is actually happening in the world drama right now. You might recall, if you listened to the previous talk, that I mentioned a comment from a student, which I really took to heart. Well, Lash takes ages to get to the point. Well, that has been a flaw of my delivery through the years. Some people would disagree with me. But I would like to say, whatever I've done through the years in getting to the point stands for what it is. It stands for itself, and you can take it or leave it. But I'm determined to change my delivery and to bring the point forward in a different way than I've done in the past. So I'm going to tell you the conclusion at the beginning. I'll give you the takeaway at the beginning. And then all the rest, if you care to listen, is simply commentary and exposition on the concluding message. Now, in doing so, I'm going to change the language slightly. Instead of using the word myth, I'm simply use the word narrative. Okay? A myth is a narrative. It's a mythic narrative. Okay? So I'm going to tell you something about the two narratives that are at war on this planet. Two and two only. The first narrative, label it Sophianic, describes the origin of the problem of the COVID-19 psyop, and it presents the correction or solution to that problem. The other narrative, label it Semitic, is not only the narrative that drives the COVID-19 psyop, but it is the source of the psyop and the source of many, many other problems that face the various races around the world today. So just, if you can, situate that proposition in your mind. The Sophianic narrative versus the Semitic narrative. Referring back to my previous talk, I emphasize again that out of the entire inventory of world myth, these are the only two that present an explanation of the origin of the human species in entirety, not merely an explanation of the origin of the race who specifically produced the myth. So they are generic origin stories rather than race-specific origin stories. Got that? So that's a very loaded statement. That is a heavily loaded proposition that I wish to put across to you here. So, my challenge: how can I elaborate to you in a user-friendly way the imperative importance of this proposition? Two myths at war for your sense of humanity. Your sense, you, whoever may be listening, it's your sense of humanity that is at stake in this war. And consequent to that, of course, is the fate of humanity itself. Nothing less than the fate of humanity itself is at stake here. Those are big words, I know. That's big talk. Those are big claims. So perhaps it would be wise, on my part, to first establish for you, briefly, how I can even make such a claim of the imperative importance of what I'm saying. Of course, the problem today facing the world, the psychological warfare of the pandemic deception, is a great problem. It's not the only problem faced by the various nations and races around the world. Obviously, the problems of the world today are many faceted, and there are many approaches to interpreting them and many approaches to resolving them. And I don't deny that. I've always said that Gnostic intel, that's what I'm giving you, is premium intel, but it is not exclusive to other intel which may be helpful or essential to facing and overcoming these difficulties which threaten the future of life on this planet. So I'm not excluding any other approaches or solutions, but I am emphasizing that the Gnostic intel is premium. Why do I say that? I ask you to think about source code. Now, source code is what code writers handle. You usually do not handle source code. So when you use a computer or any kind of IT device, you're relying on source code that has been written by others. And fortunately, you are not required to know how the source code works in order to operate the apps and the devices and the programs provided to you by those who write the code. But when it comes to mythology and mythic narratives, you are required to know the source code. Mythology is the source code of human behavior. That is a very great fact. And as I wrote years ago in metahistory.org, speaking generically of human animals, they behave as they believe. So what are your beliefs? What do you believe? What do you believe about the human species? What do you believe about your own humanity? Well, you behave according to what you believe. And a belief system, no belief system in the world exists unless it is framed in a narrative. So when you know the narrative that frames your belief system, you have access to the source code. Now, I'm sure that there are many, countless numbers of conscientious and well-meaning people today who are attempting to face this COVID-19 psyop and all the other psyops that go along with it. And I do not in any way dismiss or discount their contributions. I insist, however, that if you know the source code of the narratives that are at the basis of this problem, basis of this war, then you have a unique advantage, and that is the Gnostic Advantage, and it is always my intention to offer you that advantage. I started out by describing my greatest discovery in comparative mythology, and I emphasized the uniqueness, the outstanding character of two mythic narratives, and two only. I'm calling them now the Gnostic or Sophianic narrative, which comes from the Gnostics, and the Semitic narrative, which comes from the ancient Hebrews. Now, another discovery that comes along with that great revelation that I had is that these two myths are adversarial. They are actually opposed to each other. They are contrasted to each other in a really fascinating way. So let me see if I can, in the remainder of this short talk, describe the character of each of them and how they are in opposition in this event that I am calling the war over human identity. I'll start with the Semitic myth. Something you may have gathered already is that the Semitic myth is, without question, the most widely known myth of human origin on the planet. There's no argument about that. The term Abrahamic refers to the three so-called great world religions, i.e. belief systems: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And all three of these religions are based in mythic narratives of the same origin. They are the Abrahamic religions. So Semitic myth is Abrahamic myth. And Everyone in the world knows this myth. Everyone knows this narrative. On the other hand, the Sophianic myth is almost unknown. So I bring to your attention the remarkable fact that the two myths that are at war today, the two narratives at war on this planet, comprise one which is universally known and one which is hardly known at all. And that is the most significant fact. There is a great reason for that being so. The reason being that were the Sophianic myth to be known, the narrative that has come down to the world through the so-called Gnostics, the Semitic myth would have a formidable adversary. And I can assure you that if there were ever a free and open debate between these two myths, the Sophianic myth would win. The Sophianic myth is an enormous threat to those who follow the Semitic myth. And over the many centuries since that myth emerged, around 1800 BC, it first came into definition, over those centuries, the efforts that have been made to repress, demonize, misrepresent, and destroy the Sophianic myth have been enormous. It is a miracle that the Sophianic myth survives to this day, considering the opposition that has been waged against it over centuries. Okay, so far so good. Now let's see if I can briefly characterize for you the source code of the Semitic myth, the Semitic mythogen, that is to say, a mythic complex that describes the origin and purpose of the entire human species. Now, in doing so, I would emphasize that the word Semitic is significant in describing this source code. How so? Well, Semitic really refers to a language group, those who speak the Semitic languages, which are Hebrew, Arabic, and Aramaic. It is a very great fact, an irrefutable fact, that one mythogen has come into the world through the medium of those languages, uniquely, through the medium of the Semitic languages. So when I call it the Semitic myth, I'm referring to its language basis. The racial origin of the Semitic myth is the Hebrew people, or the Judaic race. So they produced, the Judaic race produced this myth, and it has been disseminated through the world in the Semitic languages, and remains to this day transmitted at its source through those languages and through people who speak those languages, even though, of course, it has come to be propagated universally in many languages across the world. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the narrative that you find in the Old Testament, in Scripture. So the source code, speaking in terms of documents or Scripture, is the Old Testament of the Bible, and the New Testament as well. They go together, and they are. Actually, they both carry the same message. What does the Bible say? What does the book of Genesis say? Look at the source code. It says that the Creator God in heaven created the human species in 7 days. Created the world in 7 days and the human species on the last day, something like that. The narrative is there. And it says that, again, it claims to describe the origin of all humanity. Well, what is the consequence of that claim? Well, those who propagate the Bible story, either through Judaism or Christianity or Islam in a very strange and distorted version, those who propagate this narrative all claim that they are speaking about humanity as a whole. They are talking about a story that pertains to all humanity. As I said before, if you look at the origin myth of the Aztecs or of the ancient Slavic peoples, or the Greeks or the Egyptians, their origin myths, actually, when you look at them closely, only refer to the people who have produced the mythology. But the Semitic myth claims to encompass the entire human race. Now, there's a consequence of this that you all live with, whether you know it or not, or whether you like it or not. The consequence is that everything that you hear about human rights from the United Nations, wherever, everything you hear about universal human rights, everything you hear about humanity, the universality of the human condition, comes from those who are operating from the source code of the Semitic myth. It has a tremendous claim upon human attention by the fact that it addresses all of humanity. That means all the diverse races of humanity. However, when you look closely at the source code in the first chapters of Genesis, you find that that claim is deceptive. There is a trick in the source code. It is, in a way, bugged. There is a bug in the source code. A bug, like an infection, like the flu. You got the bug, you got the flu. The Semitic source code comes to the world with the claim that it speaks of all of humanity. But it contains a deceit. And this deceit is clear if you look carefully at the language of Genesis. So, what do you see in that language? There are two terms. One term is Elohim, and the other term is Adamas, or Adam, which is a code word for all of humanity. Okay? And so it appears that Genesis speaks about the Elohim, which is actually plural, which is the gods, who have a supreme deity, El, and they create humanity, or Adam, Adamus, Adam and Eve in the mythological narrative. So it would appear at first sight, without critical scrutiny, that the story of Genesis is a story about the origin of the human species, but in fact it is not so. The source code is rigged. Better said, the source code is corrupted from its origin. How so? Well, as a matter of fact, inherent in the narrative of Genesis is a distinction. The distinction is between the Elohim, the creators of humanity, and humanity itself. And the name for humanity itself, strictly speaking, in Hebrew, is a word that is not known to most of humanity. Eshut. Now this word refers to the human species, with one exception. The common translation of this word, which many people have heard, is goyim, meaning the nations, meaning the races. So what the narrative of Genesis says is that the Elohim, which is a plural, acting in behalf of the supreme creator deity, El, Elyon, the one on high, creates all of the races. But hold on for a moment. What is the Elohim? Is the Elohim another one of the races, or is it something set apart from all the races that it creates? Well, obviously, it's set apart. So already you see in the source code of the Semitic myth that there is a division between the creator and the creatures. Now you also find that division in the Sophianic myth. I'll get to that in the next talk. What I want to emphasize here is that the source code of Semitic myth lies. It lies from the first word out of its mouth. And this lie is a great deception. This lie is behind the great deception of COVID-19 today. While the Semitic myth pretends to apply to all humanity, it doesn't really when you look at it closely. What it does is it states or establishes that there are overlords to the human races, the Goyim, who themselves are set apart. And who are these overlords? Who are the Elohim, the angelic or Elohistic creators of the human races? Well, they are, in fact, the racial group who produced this narrative. So what you see when you look closely at the source code is that it's coming from a group of people in the Semitic languages who actually claim, in a deceptive way, without coming out and saying so, that they are a superior species to the human species, and they are responsible for creating all of the variations of the human races. Now, everyone knows that the Old Testament carries the idea of the chosen people. And in fact, it is the chosen people who wrote the Old Testament. They wrote their own narrative. They also wrote it in other forms, for instance, the Talmud, Kabbalah. But principally, they established their mythogen. They wrote their own mythogen. And they wrote it so that they, the authors of this creation story, stand apart from human creatures, the Goyim, the nations. Now, due to ascribing to themselves this exclusive and superior role, they also regard themselves, the chosen people, regard themselves as entitled in a particular way. Now, the actual Hebrew term for this entitlement is Zaddik, Z-A-D-D-I-K, spelled in various ways. Sometimes it's spelled T-Z-A-D-D-I-K. And Zaddik means the righteous ones, those who are holier than thou, holier than all others. And they are the authors of the biblical narrative, of the origin story of all of humanity. But in being the authors, in writing their own script, they set themselves apart from the rest of humanity. Thus they are called the chosen people, because they chose themselves. And they are also called a people who shall dwell apart. So the mythogen of the Semitic languages describes racial exclusivity and racial supremacy. It is a narrative of racial supremacy. But there is a deceit in it, because those who place themselves above and beyond all the other races, the Goyim, assert in their narrative that they have the power to speak for the Goyim. Therefore, they have the power to dictate what are human rights, what are universal human rights. They have the power to dictate what is humane and not humane. They have the power beyond you to dictate to you human identity and to dictate to you what is your sense of humanity. In another talk that I gave, I pointed out that you do not receive your sense of humanity from your own innate sense of humanity. Unless you claim it, unless you make a special and exceptional effort to claim your sense of humanity innately from yourself, then there is a very strong chance that you, like myself, have been indoctrinated into a concept of humanity that comes from those who place themselves beyond humanity and regard themselves as the supreme overlords. It is a very great fact that in the Talmudic interpretation of the Old Testament, the Elohim, creator race, creator species, is identified with the Jewish people. That is the root of Jewish identity in the source code. And as such, that identity, that racial identity, stands apart from the identity of all the other diverse races who are called the Goyim, or the nations. So you see that there is an essential deceit in this source code. It pretends to represent you and I as members of the human species, but in fact it represents a privileged class of overlords telling you who you are, telling you what your rights are, defining to you what is just and righteous in human terms. And if you accept that indoctrination coming through that narrative, then you do not define humanity from your own inner resources. You have it defined for you by the Elohim. So, to summarize, I can tell you that the mythogen of the Jewish people is unique in claiming to describe the origin of the species. But it is also unique in the way it divides the human species into a lower class and a higher class. And the authors of the mythogen place themselves in the higher class. So the narrative of the Old Testament and Talmudic writings and other writings gives to the Jewish people the entitlement of racial supremacy. And consistent with that narrative, they see themselves as the handlers of the other races, all the non-Jewish races. They regard themselves as the handlers And in one respect, they regard themselves as benevolent handlers, and in another respect, at the same time, consistent with the factor of cognitive dissonance in the source code, they define themselves as the punitive overlords of all the other races. In short, they are the master race. So the one thing you need to know about the mythogen that comes through the Semitic languages is that it is a mandate, a mission statement of racial supremacy. And the race, the unique race, that is designated as superior and supreme is the race that has produced the narrative. Simple enough. Now I'm going to leave it at that, but I do want to leave you with a teaser. I'll put it in the form of the question, a question. Well, if the Semitic mythogen is a narrative of racial supremacy, how would you characterize the Sophianic mythogen? Well, it's a mythogen of racial singularity. Singularity. In fact, the word singularity occurs in the Gnostic Coptic writings in Greek. That word is monogenes, which means single generating. So, in conclusion, I present you with a proposition of these two myths. I've characterized, to some extent, profiled the mythogen of the ancient Hebrews, which survives today in one form or another through all three of the Abrahamic religions, and it survives in many policies of world affairs, many economic, political, educational policies are actually underwritten by the Semitic source code. So it is a tremendously powerful driver of human behavior. To some extent, those who are driven by that narrative don't know that they are, and they've never seen the source code. To another extent, you can be damn sure that those who are driving that narrative know exactly what the source code is upon which they base their worldview and their policies of world domination. So I'll leave it at that till the next talk, when I profile the Sophianic narrative, mythogen of the Gnostics, describing the origin and purpose of human existence on this planet. And in that talk, I'll attempt to show you how and why these two myths are in a mortal conflict. And the fate of humanity is at stake in that conflict.